My wife's sister hosted a lavish party to celebrate becoming CFO of our family company. Why is the coffee man here? She sneered, unaware I owned 77% of the business. The next morning, when she walked into her new office, my name is Lawson Pierce, and if you saw me walking into a board meeting carrying 2 cappuccinos and a legal pad, you'd probably think I was someone's well-dressed intern. That's perfectly fine by me. See, I learned something valuable during my 3 years at Columbia Law that most of my classmates missed while they were busy networking their asses off at firm mixers. Silence wins more arguments than shouting ever will. While they were practicing their elevator pitches, I was studying the fine print in merger agreements, learning how power actually flows through corporate structures like water, finding the lowest point. Before I married Sophia Leong. Back when I was still grinding 80-hour weeks at Cravath doing M&A work that would make a normal person question their life choices, I thought I understood how business worked. You know, the textbook version. Shareholders elect boards. Boards hire management. Management runs companies. Everyone plays nice and follows Delaware corporate law. What a load of bullshit that turned out to be. Real business is messy, more personal, and way more interesting than anything they teach you in corporations class. I left the firm not because I hated corporate law. Hell, I loved the chess match of it all. The way a well-drafted contract could shift millions of dollars with just the right combination of words. But because I saw an opportunity that was too good to pass up. Legal technology was stuck in the Stone Age. Lawyers were still printing discovery documents by the truckload, highlighting relevant passages with actual highlighters like they were studying for the bar exam all over again. So I built Verdict AI, a machine learning engine that could read through millions of pages of evidence and organize it better than any first-year associate pulling all-nighters on Adderall and Spite. The AI stack we developed wasn't just another legal tech SaaS trying to automate document review. Our machine learning models could identify patterns across cases, predict judicial outcomes, and build evidence maps that would make seasoned litigators weep with joy. We were processing natural language at a level that made the competition look like they were using calculators while we had supercomputers. But building a startup, even a promising one, meant burning through cash faster than a hedge fund manager burns through marriages. That's when Sophia's family company, Leong Meridian Group, hit what the finance bros like to call a liquidity event, which is corporate speak for, oh shit, we're running out of money. LMG had been around for decades, built by Sophia's grandfather into a solid mid-market operation with tentacles in everything from commercial real estate to import logistics. But the pandemic had kicked them in the teeth. Their credit lines were tighter than a Tom Ford suit, and their cash flow looked like a Jackson Pollock painting, messy and hard to interpret. When Chairman Hal Leong, my father-in-law and a man who still believed in handshake deals and honor, came to me with the situation, I didn't see a dying company. I saw an opportunity that would make my corporate law professors proud and my old firm partners sick with envy. While everyone else was running away from distressed assets like they had the plague, I was stepping in with a briefcase full of solutions and a term sheet that would have made even the sharks at KKR take notes. I bought their distressed notes at a discount that would make a bankruptcy vulture blush. Then I restructured their debt, converting a significant portion to equity during a quiet recapitalization that flew under everyone's radar. The beauty of it was in the details. Different classes of shares sitting in different corporate entities. Preferred stock with conversion features that only triggered under specific circumstances, and protective provisions buried so deep in the fine print that you'd need a team of securities lawyers and a lot of coffee to understand them. When the dust settled and the lawyers had filed their forms with the Delaware Secretary of State, the math was elegantly simple. I controlled 77% of LMG's voting shares. Not through some hostile takeover bullshit or corporate rating. Just good old-fashioned financial engineering and a deep understanding of how equity structures actually work when you strip away all the noise. Hal asked me to keep the ownership structure quiet until the company stabilized. Give people time to adjust, he said, and I respected that. The man had built something real over 4 decades, and I wasn't about to piss all over his legacy by showing up like some private equity asshole with a restructuring plan and a PowerPoint presentation about operational efficiencies. So I played the part. I wore my Tom Ford suits, navy wool, perfectly tailored, the kind that whispers expensive rather than screaming it. I drove my Tesla Model S, not because I gave a damn about saving the planet, but because it was fast, quiet, and had enough tech in it to make my phone look primitive. We lived in an Upper West Side penthouse that offered the kind of view that made Manhattan look like a toy city you could rearrange with your fingers. When I looked down at the streets below, crawling with yellow cabs and hurried pedestrians, it was easy to forget that real power rarely announces itself. I brought coffee to meetings because I genuinely liked seeing people work well. Good coffee, the kind that costs more per pound than most people make in a day, served in real cups instead of those paper abominations that make everything taste like cardboard. I'd walk into conference rooms with a tray of cappuccinos, perfectly crafted by our office's ridiculously expensive espresso machine, and watch people's faces light up like I'd just handed them Christmas morning. What they didn't know, what nobody needed to know yet, was that I also happened to own the building, metaphorically speaking. While they were sipping their coffee and discussing quarterly projections, I was running the numbers in my head, tracking every expense, every revenue stream, every potential vulnerability in our market position. I knew our cash flow better than most people knew their own bank accounts. I understood our competitive landscape, our customer acquisition costs, our lifetime value metrics, and exactly how much runway we had before we'd need to make some serious decisions. Verdict AI was humming along nicely, signing up mid-market law firms faster than we could onboard them. Our series of funding had gone smoothly, and we were already getting interest for a Series B round that would value the company somewhere in the nine-figure range. The legal tech market was exploding, and we were positioned perfectly to capture a significant chunk of it. Venture capital firms were circling like sharks at a SEAL convention, throwing around term sheets with valuations that would make your head spin. But the real play wasn't just Verdict AI. It was the integration opportunity with LMG, the potential for cross-selling our AI services to their client base, the economies of scale we could achieve by combining operations. I could see the synergies that Wall Street analysts dream about, the kind of strategic positioning that could turn two solid companies into one unstoppable force. From the outside, I looked like the quiet son-in-law who knew his place. Sophia's family treated me with the kind of respectful distance reserved for useful outsiders, polite, appreciative, but never quite inner circle. At family dinners, I'd listen to discussions about company strategy, offering occasional insights that were well received, but never given too much weight. I was the tech guy, the startup founder, the one who understood artificial intelligence and machine learning, but probably didn't grasp the complexities of running a real business. That perception worked perfectly for me. While everyone else was busy positioning themselves for influence, making grand pronouncements about market opportunities and strategic visions, I was quietly building an empire one carefully structured transaction at a time. Every contract I reviewed, every compliance issue I flagged, every operational improvement I suggested was another brick in a foundation that was becoming unshakable. The coffee cup in my hand had become my signature prop, a visual reminder that I was there to help, not to threaten. People trusted the coffee guy. They shared information with him, asked his opinion on technical matters, included him in discussions that they might have kept private from someone they perceived as competition. And tomorrow, when Ivy Leong would throw her $48,000 party to celebrate her appointment as CFO, surrounded by admirers who thought they understood how power worked in corporate America, I'd be there with my cappuccinos and my quiet smile, watching the show and waiting for the right moment to remind everyone exactly who was writing the checks. The Mandarin Oriental's penthouse ballroom cost $48,000 for the night. I know this because I approved the expense 3 weeks ago when Ivy submitted the CFO celebration event through our corporate card system. What I didn't approve was the guest list that read like a who's who of Manhattan's most insufferable trust fund babies, private equity junior associates, and venture capital wannabes who couldn't tell the difference between a Series A term sheet and a restaurant menu. But hey, it was Ivy's night to shine, and if she wanted to blow enough money to fund a small startup's MVP development on imported orchids and a string quartet that probably graduated from Juilliard with more debt than talent, who was I to judge? After all, I was just the guy who wrote the check. The venue itself was admittedly spectacular. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, crystal chandeliers that cost more than most people's cars, and enough marble to make a Roman emperor jealous. The kind of place where you half expected to see oil paintings of dead robber barons judging you from gilded frames. Everything screamed old money, which was ironic considering most of the people in attendance had inherited their portfolios rather than built them. I walked in carrying 2 cappuccinos, not because I'm some kind of masochist who enjoys being mistaken for waitstaff, but because I'd spotted Jessica Chun and Marcus Rivera, 2 junior analysts who'd been volunteered to work the registration desk. These kids were pulling 60-hour weeks trying to model our Q4 projections while also studying for their CFAs, and they looked like they hadn't seen caffeine in approximately 18 hours. The party was in full swing by the time I arrived. A jazz quartet, not the string quartet I'd been promised, but whatever, was playing something that sounded like elevator music's pretentious older brother. The smoked oysters were arranged on ice sculptures that were already starting to melt under the ambient lighting, creating little puddles that some poor catering staff member would have to mop up every 10 minutes. Ivy held court at the center table, surrounded by her usual crew of sycophants and social climbers. She was wearing what I'm pretty sure was a custom Hermes dress that probably cost more than our head of compliance's monthly salary, her hair done in some elaborate updo that required the kind of engineering precision usually reserved for suspension bridges. Her audience tonight was particularly nauseating. There was Bradley Whitman III, yes, the third, whose family's hedge fund had been underperforming the S&P 500 for 3 consecutive years, but who still acted like he was the next Warren Buffett. He was regaling the table with stories about his latest deal flow, while casually mentioning his new Patek Philippe like it was a fun fact rather than a desperate plea for relevance. Next to him sat Miranda Ashworth, a venture capital associate at some Sandhill Road firm, whose claim to fame was leading due diligence on a food delivery app that burned through $40 million before pivoting to pet grooming. She was currently explaining to anyone who'd listen how her portfolio companies were disrupting traditional markets through innovative synergies, which is venture capital speak for, "We have no idea what we're doing, but the PowerPoint looks impressive." Then there was Preston Hayes, whose private equity firm specialized in buying up distressed retail chains and somehow making them even more distressed. He'd arrived via private jet, not his own, mind you, but borrowed from Daddy's firm, and hadn't shut up about the opportunities in the current market environment for the past 20 minutes. Kid couldn't spell EBITDA if you spotted him the first 4 letters, but he sure looked good in his Ralph Lauren suit. I made my way through the crowd, nodding politely at familiar faces and expertly avoiding eye contact with anyone who might want to pitch me their brilliant new fintech startup idea. The combination of open bar and networking opportunities had created the kind of atmosphere where every conversation sounded like a TED Talk about disruption and innovation. When I reached Jessica and Marcus at their little registration station, positioned strategically by the entrance so they could check names off lists while watching everyone else enjoy themselves, I set down the cappuccinos and caught the look of pure gratitude that crossed their faces. "You're literally a lifesaver," Jessica whispered, wrapping her hands around the warm cup like it was a life preserver. "I've been here since for setting up place cards and listening to people complain about the valet situation." "How's the turnout?" I asked, genuinely curious about who'd actually shown up to this circus. "Bigger than expected," Marcus replied, taking a sip of his cappuccino and immediately looking more human. "Half the guest list are people I've never heard of, but apparently they're all very important in the alternative investment space." He made air quotes, and I had to suppress a laugh. That's when I noticed the conversation at Ivy's table had shifted to that particular tone that meant someone was about to say something truly stupid. You know the sound, voices getting louder, gestures getting more animated, the kind of performative discussion that happens when people are more interested in being overheard than actually communicating. "The beauty of our acquisition strategy," Preston was explaining to a rapt audience, "is that we identify undervalued assets in mature markets and leverage operational efficiencies to maximize shareholder value." Miranda nodded sagely, like she was hearing the secret to cold fusion rather than generic private equity buzzword bingo. "That's exactly the kind of strategic thinking we look for in our portfolio companies. It's all about finding those hidden gems that haven't been properly monetized." Bradley chimed in with his own nugget of wisdom. "In today's market environment, you really need to have a sophisticated understanding of capital structures and debt instruments. Most entrepreneurs just don't grasp the complexity of institutional finance. I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing. These trust fund babies were discussing capital structures like they'd invented the concept, when the most complex financial instrument any of them had probably handled was their dad's American Express Black Card. Ivy was basking in the attention, clearly loving her role as the newly minted CFO holding court among the city's financial elite. She'd spent the last hour dropping casual references to our board meetings and strategic partnerships, like she was running Goldman Sachs instead of getting handed a title at a company that would have been bankrupt if not for my intervention. That's when she noticed me standing there with the empty coffee cups, and her expression shifted in a way that made my stomach tighten. Not with nervousness. I'd faced down hostile takeover attempts and Securities and Exchange Commission investigations, but with the kind of anticipation you get when you realize someone's about to step on a landmine of their own making. Ivy looked past me first, scanning the crowd like she was searching for someone more important to acknowledge. Then her gaze landed on me directly, and that practiced society smile spread across her face like butter on warm toast. "Why is the coffee man here?" she said, her voice carrying just loud enough for the entire table to hear. Her admirers glanced in my direction with that particular brand of polite dismissal reserved for service staff who've somehow wandered into the wrong social stratum. The silence that followed was the kind you hear right before thunder. Jessica and Marcus suddenly became very interested in their registration lists. A few nearby conversations faltered as people turned to see what was happening. Even the jazz quartet seemed to miss a note. Sophia, who'd been chatting with some family friends near the bar, looked over with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not embarrassed, exactly, but not pleased either. She knew what was coming, could probably feel the shift in atmospheric pressure that precedes a storm. I set the empty cups down on Jessica's table, straightened my Tom Ford jacket, and kept my voice exactly as steady as I'd learned to do during particularly contentious depositions. The kind of calm that makes opposing counsel nervous because it suggests you're holding cards they can't see. "Congratulations, Ivy," I said, meeting her eyes directly. "Tomorrow will be interesting." The words hung in the air like smoke from an expensive cigar, carrying implications that everyone could feel but nobody quite understood. Preston stopped mid-gesture. Miranda's wine glass paused halfway to her lips. Bradley actually looked confused, which wasn't particularly difficult to achieve, but was still satisfying to witness. Ivy's smile flickered for just a moment, like a glitch in perfectly programmed software. She was smart enough to sense that something had just shifted, but not quite smart enough to understand what. I turned and walked toward the exit, leaving behind the imported orchids, the melting ice sculptures, and $48,000 worth of celebration that was about to become a very expensive lesson in corporate governance. Tomorrow morning, we had a board meeting scheduled for 9 o'clock sharp. And tomorrow, the real party would begin. Back at the penthouse, I hung up my Tom Ford jacket with the kind of care you reserve for armor that served you well in battle. The city sprawled below our floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan's grid system looking deceptively orderly from 40 stories up. Funny how chaos always looks organized from enough distance. I poured myself 2 fingers of Macallan 25, the kind of single malt that costs more per bottle than most people's monthly rent, and settled into my home office. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was about to dismantle someone's career using the same leather-bound closing binders that most lawyers only break out for their biggest deals. But then again, this was a big deal. The biggest, actually. The cap table didn't shout, it whispered. That's the thing about really sophisticated financial engineering. It doesn't need to announce itself with flashy presentations or dramatic board resolutions. It just sits there in the fine print, patient as a spider in its web, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. I opened the first binder, labeled LMG Recapitalization, Series A Preferred, and felt that familiar rush that comes from reviewing perfectly crafted legal documents. This wasn't some hastily thrown together term sheet scribbled on a cocktail napkin. This was months of work by some of the sharpest securities lawyers in Manhattan, each provision carefully calibrated to achieve maximum strategic advantage while maintaining the appearance of standard venture capital structuring. The Series A preferred shares were the foundation of the whole structure. They carried standard liquidation preferences, anti-dilution protection, and board representation rights that looked perfectly normal to anyone doing a casual review. What made them special was the conversion trigger buried in Section 4.3(b)(2). Automatic conversion to common stock with enhanced voting rights when the company achieved 12 consecutive months of positive EBITDA or received acquisition interest above a specified valuation threshold. We'd hit that EBITDA target 3 months ago. The conversion had triggered automatically, governed by Delaware corporate law and about as revocable as gravity. Suddenly, my preferred shares weren't just preferred anymore. They were voting common stock with a coefficient that reflected the original liquidation multiple. Then there was the Series B warrant package, equally elegant in its simplicity. When I'd structured Verdict AI's integration with LMG, we'd done it through a subsidiary merger that included warrant coverage for management. Standard startup stuff, the kind of equity incentive plan that every Silicon Valley lawyer could draft in their sleep. Except our warrants had an accelerated vesting provision tied to corporate development activities, which included debt restructuring, strategic partnerships, and technology acquisitions. Verdict AI's roll-in had triggered every single warrant overnight. But the real masterpiece was the debt-for-equity swap we'd executed during the worst part of the pandemic. While everyone else was running around like their hair was on fire, wondering if the world economy was going to collapse, I was having very productive conversations with distressed debt funds who were more than happy to sell LMG's outstanding notes at 70 cents on the dollar. I'd bought those notes through a Delaware LLC that was wholly owned by another Delaware LLC that was, in turn, controlled by a family trust that Sophia and I had established for estate planning purposes. Completely legal, thoroughly documented, and invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for it. When the company couldn't service the debt, which, let's be honest, was always the plan, I'd offered to convert it to equity at a discount to the last private valuation. The board had approved it unanimously. How it actually thanked me for my flexibility and family commitment. What they didn't realize was that the equity I was taking carried protective provisions that were standard for institutional investors: board expansion rights, intellectual property veto power, and drag-along rights on any acquisition above $50 million. I flipped to the summary page and ran the numbers one more time, just because I'm obsessive about details and because the Macallan was making me feel philosophical about the beauty of well-structured transactions. Preferred shares post-conversion, 31.2% voting control. Series B warrants exercised, 18.7% voting control. Debt-to-equity conversion, 19.4% voting control. Original founder shares, purchased separately, 7.7% voting control. Total, 77% voting control of Leong Meridian Group. The math was elegant, irrefutable, and completely legally bulletproof. I'd run it past 3 different securities lawyers, including Mireille, and gotten the same answer every time. Textbook perfect. The kind of corporate governance that would make Delaware Chancery Court judges nod approvingly if it ever came to litigation. Not that it would. That's the beauty of doing things properly from the beginning. Nobody can challenge what they can attack on legal grounds. I closed the cap table binder and opened my laptop to start the real work. Tomorrow's board meeting was going to require some preparation, and I wanted every detail locked down tighter than a federal prison. First call, Mireille. Even though it was past 11 p.m., I knew she'd be awake. General counsels at growing companies don't keep bankers' hours, especially when there's potential drama brewing. She picked up on the second ring. "Let me guess," she said without preamble. "Someone finally noticed the ownership structure." Something like that. "We need to schedule a board meeting for 9 a.m. tomorrow. Full board, no proxies, with complete cap table disclosure." Jesus, Lawson, you're really going to do this? I took a sip of the Macallan and watched a helicopter trace its way across the Hudson River, its lights blinking like a mechanical firefly. Ivy made the choice for me. I just found out she's been having unauthorized conversations with Atlas Ridge about a potential recapitalization. Also reached out to Lextronix about acquiring Verdict AI without board approval. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Then Mireille whistled low. That's incredibly stupid. That's fiduciary duty breach territory. Maybe securities fraud if she was making representations about her authority to negotiate on behalf of the company. I'll draft the meeting notice. Do you want me to include the preliminary investigation memo? Not yet. Let's just focus on governance and disclosure. I want this to look like standard corporate housekeeping, not a witch hunt. Next call, compliance. Amina Farouk had been with LMG for 8 years, long enough to understand how the company operated, but not so long that she'd gotten comfortable with cutting corners. She was exactly the kind of person you wanted running compliance during a sensitive transition. Amina, it's Lawson. I need you to freeze all non-budgeted expenditures effective 8:30 tomorrow morning. No exceptions without board approval. Can I ask why? Governance review. Also, I need access logs for anyone who's touched the finance system in the last 30 days, particularly around vendor setup and payment authorization. I'll have that ready by 8 a.m. Thanks. And Amina, keep this quiet until after the board meeting. The final piece was Verdict AI's technology stack. Our AI models represented hundreds of thousands of hours of development work and millions of dollars in training data. If someone was going to try to extract value from the company through a hostile transaction, they'd need access to our intellectual property. Time to make sure that wasn't possible. I remote accessed our AWS environment and pushed a security patch that would encrypt our machine learning model weights with a key that only I controlled. Anyone trying to export the models would get useless garbage. It was the digital equivalent of changing the locks on your house after a bad breakup. My phone buzzed with a text from Sophia. You were cold tonight. I stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back. Tomorrow is business. Sleep well. It wasn't that I didn't care about Sophia's feelings, or that I enjoyed the position this put her in with her family. But business is business, and family dynamics don't override fiduciary duties or corporate governance. Ivy had made choices that threatened the company, and I had obligations to shareholders, including Sophia's father, that superseded keeping family dinners comfortable. I finished the Macallan and closed my laptop. Outside, the city hummed with its usual late-night energy, millions of people making decisions that would ripple through markets, careers, and lives in ways they couldn't imagine. Tomorrow morning, I'd add one more ripple to that vast network of cause and effect. The closing binders went back on the shelf, but I kept the summary sheet on my desk. Tomorrow at 9 a.m., that single piece of paper would change everything. Numbers don't lie, and neither do properly executed legal documents. Time to remind everyone how capitalism actually works when you know what you're doing. The LMG conference room was all glass and steel, the kind of architectural statement that screamed, "We take ourselves very seriously," while somehow managing to look like every other corporate boardroom in Manhattan. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the East River that would have been inspiring if you weren't about to destroy someone's career before lunch. I arrived at 8:45, which in board meeting time is practically dawn. The conference table was already set up with leather portfolios, crystal water glasses, and the kind of expensive pins that nobody actually uses but everyone expects to see at important meetings. Our facilities team had even put out a selection of Danish pastries that probably cost more per pound than most people's groceries, because nothing says serious corporate governance like overpriced carbohydrates. Chairman Hao Liang sat at the head of the table, looking every bit the patriarch he was. At 72, he still had the bearing of someone who'd built a company from nothing, though the weight of the last few years showed in the lines around his eyes. He'd asked me to keep the ownership structure quiet, and I'd honored that request. Now it was time to honor my obligations as a shareholder. Helena Duarte and Arjun Patel, our independent directors, were reviewing their materials with the kind of careful attention that suggested they actually read board packages instead of just nodding along like rubber stamps. Helena had spent 20 years in investment banking before retiring to a portfolio of board positions, while Arjun brought operational experience from his days running a mid-market manufacturing company. Both were exactly the kind of directors you wanted when things got complicated. Dr. Mireille Okafor appeared on the wall-mounted screen, dialing in from her home office in Brooklyn. As general counsel, she'd seen every document I was about to reference, helped structure half the transactions that got us here, and understood the legal implications better than anyone in the room. The slight smile on her face suggested she was looking forward to this almost as much as I was. Marco Rinaldi, our COO, occupied the chair across from me. Marco was old-school operations, the kind of executive who could tell you the exact cost per unit of everything we manufactured and the name of every key supplier. He'd been with LMG for 12 years, long enough to remember when cash flow was a problem we solved with bank loans rather than complex financial engineering. At exactly 9:06, fashionably late, as always, Ivy swept into the conference room carrying what appeared to be a leather-bound presentation folder thick enough to stop a bullet. Her CFO onboarding binder, no doubt, filled with strategic initiatives, cost optimization plans, and PowerPoint slides about synergistic opportunities. She was wearing another designer suit, this one a charcoal Armani that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, and she moved with the confidence of someone who genuinely believed she was about to take control of a board meeting. "Lawson," she said, settling into her chair with practiced grace, "I have budget reviews scheduled for 10, so let's try to keep this efficient. I know you mean well with your compliance suggestions, but we really need to focus on execution rather than." I clicked the remote. The wall screen lit up with a single slide. LMG ownership structure, as of current date. No fancy graphics, no corporate template design, just black text on a white background showing the kind of information that changes everything. The numbers were right there in Times New Roman, 24-point font, impossible to miss or misinterpret. Lawson Pierce, various entities, 77% voting control. Leong Family Trust, 15.2% voting control. Employee stock option pool, 4.1% voting control. Independent directors, 2.4% voting control. Other minority shareholders, 1.3% voting control. Ivy's eyes moved across the screen like she was reading a menu in a foreign language. I watched her process the information in real time, the slight tilt of her head, the way her perfectly manicured fingers tightened around her presentation folder, the exact moment when the implications hit her like a freight train carrying Delaware corporate law textbooks. "No," she said, and then laughed. Actually laughed, like someone had just told her the best joke she'd heard all week. "This is wrong. This has to be wrong. Michael." She turned to Hao, using his first name with the kind of familiarity that suggested she'd never doubted her place in the family hierarchy. "Chairman, tell him this is wrong." Hao folded his hands in front of him, the gesture of a man who'd been dreading this moment for months. "Ivy, the company exists because Lawson refinanced it. These numbers reflect transactions that were properly approved by this board and documented by our securities lawyers." I kept my voice calm, the same tone I'd used during depositions when opposing counsel was about to have a very bad day. The ownership structure reflects 3 separate transactions. The Series A preferred conversion, which triggered automatically when we hit our EBITDA targets. The Series B warrant exercise, which was tied to Verdict AI's integration. And the debt-to-equity swap, which converted outstanding notes during our liquidity crisis. Helena Duarte leaned forward, her investment banking background clearly kicking in. "These are standard private equity structures. The conversion triggers were disclosed in all the original documentation." "Exactly." Mireille's voice came through the speaker with the precision of someone who drafted half these documents herself. "Every transaction was arm's length, properly valued, and approved by independent board members with full disclosure of potential conflicts." Ivy's laugh had turned hollow, the sound of someone realizing they'd been playing checkers while everyone else was playing chess. "But I'm the CFO. I was just appointed CFO yesterday. You can't just sideline a CFO on day one." I clicked to the next slide. Board Resolution, Governance Review. Again, simple text, no fancy formatting. Sometimes the most powerful documents are the ones that don't try to be powerful. "We're implementing a comprehensive governance review," I said, maintaining that same calm tone. "Effective immediately, we'll be pausing CFO onboarding pending completion of this review. We'll also be examining certain recent transactions, hiring decisions, and contract discussions that may have exceeded authorized limits." The silence that followed was the kind you hear in a library at midnight, or in a courtroom when a jury is about to deliver a verdict that everyone knows will be devastating. Marco was staring at his hands. Helena and Arjun were carefully maintaining neutral expressions. Hal looked like a man watching his family company navigate a minefield he'd helped create. Ivy's designer composure was beginning to crack around the edges. "You can't do this. This is a coup. A hostile takeover disguised as a family dinner." I shook my head slowly. A hostile takeover is when someone acquires control against management's wishes. This is a majority shareholder exercising governance rights that were properly documented and legally obtained. There's a difference. What difference? Ivy's voice was rising now, the careful modulation slipping away to reveal something rawer underneath. You've been planning this for months, haven't you? Sitting in meetings, bringing coffee, playing the helpful son-in-law while you were actually what? Building some kind of corporate empire. I was building relationships, I replied, and making sure this company survived long enough for everyone to keep their jobs. Arjun Patel cleared his throat, the sound of someone who'd seen enough boardroom drama to recognize when it was time to focus on facts rather than feelings. Ivy, do you have any specific objections to the governance review itself? Are there particular aspects of the CFO role transition that you believe require immediate attention? It was a lifeline, professionally offered. A chance for Ivy to pivot from emotional reaction to substantive business discussion, to show that she could separate personal dynamics from corporate governance. To prove that maybe, just maybe, she understood how to operate at this level. Instead, she pointed directly at me. You pour coffee and think you're a king. And there it was. The moment when someone shows you exactly who they are when the pressure gets turned up. Not a CFO worried about fiduciary duties or shareholder value. Not a family member concerned about the company's future. Just someone who'd fundamentally misunderstood the nature of power and was now learning the difference between authority and control. I stood up slowly, straightening my jacket with the deliberate care of someone who'd just won a chess match in 4 moves. I pour coffee so people can build things. I bought debt so they could keep building. And now I'm exercising shareholder rights so they can continue building without unnecessary distractions. The math was simple. 77% voting control meant I could remove directors, approve major transactions, and set strategic direction with or without anyone else's cooperation. But I preferred cooperation. It made everything run smoother. The board will vote on the governance review, I continued. All in favor. 5 hands went up. Helena, Arjun, Hal, Marco, and mine. Mireille's voice came through the speaker. General Counsel votes in favor. Ivy's hand remained firmly in her lap. Motion carries, I said. Security will collect your building access credentials. Someone from HR will be in touch about the administrative details. As Ivy gathered her presentation folder and what remained of her dignity, I felt something that wasn't quite satisfaction. Maybe it was relief. Or maybe it was just the quiet pleasure that comes from watching a perfectly executed plan reach its logical conclusion. Tomorrow, we'd start the real work of running a company. Today, we just reminded everyone who was actually in charge of writing the checks. You know what they say about giving someone enough rope to hang themselves? Ivy hadn't just taken the rope. She'd woven it into a goddamn noose, tied it into a perfect slip knot, and then live-streamed herself putting her head through it while explaining her strategic vision to anyone who'd listen. The forensic accounting started immediately after the board meeting. I'd tasked Amina from compliance with pulling every email, every expense report, every vendor approval, and every contract signature that had Ivy's fingerprints on it. What we found wasn't just garden-variety corporate overreach. It was a masterclass in how to violate fiduciary duties while documenting your crimes in real time. First up, compensation packages. Ivy had managed to approve salary increases for 2 of her friends from business school before she'd even officially started as CFO. Jessica Park, who'd been hired as a strategic planning associate at a base salary that was roughly 30% above market rate, plus equity that would have made a Series B startup founder jealous. Then there was David Chun, no relation to our analyst Jessica, just another coincidentally Asian surname in Manhattan finance, who'd been brought in as Director of Business Development, with a compensation package that included a BMW allowance and what appeared to be unlimited expense privileges. The beautiful part was how she'd structured the approvals. Instead of going through proper channels, minor details like board authorization for executive compensation above certain thresholds, she'd created her own approval process. A few emails to HR about onboarding efficiency, some casual mentions of competitive benchmarking in team meetings, and suddenly we had 2 new employees making more money than people who'd been with the company for a decade. Mireille was practically vibrating with professional outrage as she walked me through the documentation. Look at this, she said, pointing to an email thread that was like Christmas morning for employment lawyers. She's literally telling HR that as CFO-elect, I have authority to expedite critical hires. There's no such thing as CFO-elect authority in our corporate governance documents. But the compensation bullshit was small potatoes compared to what she'd been doing with our actual business strategy. Buried in a folder labeled Strategic Initiatives, corporate speak for expensive ideas that sound smart in PowerPoint. We found Ivy's grand vision for transforming LMG from a profitable, stable operation into whatever the hell was trendy in business school case studies this semester. She wanted to reallocate our entire R&D budget, money that was currently funding Verdict AI's next-generation machine learning algorithms, towards something called brand positioning and market awareness enhancement, which, as far as I could tell from the proposal documents, meant hiring a boutique consulting firm to redesign our logo and maybe get us featured in some industry publications that nobody reads. She wants to spend $2 million on brand consulting, Marco said, looking at the proposal like it was written in hieroglyphics. We're a B2B operation. Our customers care about delivery times and contract compliance, not whether our fucking logo looks good on Instagram. The consulting firm in question was Meridian Brand Strategies. And yes, the name similarity was intentional. Turns out they were founded by another one of Ivy's Wharton classmates, someone named Trevor Blackstone, who'd spent the last 5 years helping startups burn through venture capital money on new brand experiences and narrative architecture. But even that wasn't the crown jewel of Ivy's stupidity. The real masterpiece was hiding in her sent folder, in a thread she'd apparently forgotten to delete after the board meeting. Atlas Ridge Capital had been circling LMG for months, the way private equity firms circle any successful family business that might be vulnerable to a recapitalization. Their standard playbook approached the company with promises of strategic growth capital and operational expertise, loaded up with debt, strip out anything valuable, and then flip it to the highest bidder or take it public in a few years. Normal protocol for handling acquisition interest is pretty straightforward. Inform the board, engage investment bankers if appropriate, and let the shareholders decide whether they want to explore a transaction. What you don't do, what no rational person with a functioning understanding of corporate governance would ever do, is start negotiating directly with the potential acquirer before you've even officially started your job. But Ivy wasn't just any rational person. She was a visionary leader with innovative ideas about fiduciary responsibilities. The email thread with Atlas Ridge started 3 weeks before her CFO appointment was even announced. Preliminary discussions about strategic alternatives, she called them. What they actually were was Ivy positioning herself as the key contact for any potential deal, promising Atlas Ridge insider access to financial data, and hinting that she could influence family shareholders to support a transaction. Look at this one, Amina said, highlighting an email that was so legally problematic it probably violated multiple federal securities laws simultaneously. She's telling them that certain family dynamics create opportunities for motivated sellers and that she can provide guidance on optimal negotiating strategies. Translation: she was planning to help private equity vultures figure out how to pressure her own family into selling the company that had supported them for 3 generations. But wait, there's more. Because apparently unauthorized acquisition negotiations weren't enough excitement for 1 week, Ivy had also been having casual conversations with Lextronix, Verdict AI's biggest competitor, about potential synergies and integration opportunities. In case you're not fluent in startup bullshit, synergies means we want to buy your technology and fire your employees, and integration opportunities means we think we can steal your customers and your intellectual property at the same time. The Lextronix emails were even more damaging because they showed Ivy had been sharing confidential information about Verdict AI's product roadmap, customer acquisition costs, and competitive positioning. Information that, if it got into the wrong hands, could have destroyed our ability to compete in the legal tech market. She sent them our Series B pitch deck, I said, staring at the email attachment with the kind of fascination usually reserved for car accidents and reality TV shows. The one with our customer retention metrics and revenue projections. Mireille was already drafting cease and desist letters to both Atlas Ridge and Lextronix, demanding return of all confidential materials and threatening legal action that would make their corporate counsel wake up in cold sweats. This is textbook breach of fiduciary duty, she said, her voice carrying the satisfaction of a prosecutor who'd just been handed a confession video. Plus potential violations of securities law, trade secret misappropriation, and probably a few other charges I haven't thought of yet. The board reconvened that afternoon in emergency session. No fanfare this time, no presentations, just a conference room full of very serious people reviewing very damaging evidence. Helena and Arjun had spent their lunch break consulting with their own legal advisors, and they looked like judges preparing to sentence someone for embezzlement. The pattern of behavior is clear, Helena said, reviewing Amina's compliance report with the methodical attention of someone who'd seen this kind of corporate malfeasance before. Unauthorized compensation decisions, misallocation of corporate resources, disclosure of confidential information to competitors and potential acquirers. This isn't a case of poor judgment. This is systematic breach of fiduciary duties. Ivy tried one last desperate gambit, the corporate equivalent of pleading not guilty by reason of temporary insanity. These were exploratory conversations, she insisted. Due diligence. Strategic planning. Everything I did was in the company's best interests. Arjun looked up from his tablet, where he'd been researching Delaware case law on director and officer liability. Sending proprietary financial data to competitors without board authorization isn't strategic planning, he said with the kind of patient tone usually reserved for explaining basic concepts to children. It's corporate espionage. The vote was unanimous. Administrative leave pending completion of the compliance investigation. Security would collect her badge, her corporate cards, and access to all company systems. Her company laptop would be forensically imaged, her email accounts preserved, and her authorization to bind the company in any capacity immediately revoked. This is a witch hunt, Ivy said, but her voice had lost all its earlier confidence. She looked around the room like she was expecting someone to come to her rescue, to point out that this was all a big misunderstanding, that she was just an ambitious executive trying to add value. I stood up and straightened my tie, the same gesture I'd made that morning when the ownership structure had first appeared on the screen. This isn't a witch hunt, Ivy. This is corporate governance. When you take fiduciary responsibility seriously, this is what accountability looks like. The security guard was waiting outside the conference room with a cardboard box and a very professional expression that suggested he'd done this before. Ivy gathered her things with as much dignity as someone can manage while being escorted out of their own family's company. As the elevator doors closed behind her, I couldn't help but think about the $48,000 party she'd thrown just 2 days earlier. All that imported orchid money, and she'd never even gotten to finish her first week as CFO. Sometimes the market corrects itself faster than you expect. The penthouse felt different when I got home that evening. Same marble countertops, same floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, same ridiculously expensive Italian furniture that Sophia had insisted would create the right impression for entertaining. But the atmosphere had shifted in that subtle way that happens when family dynamics implode and everyone's trying to pretend everything's still normal. Sophia was sitting at our dining table, a custom walnut piece that cost more than most people's cars, with her laptop open and what looked like every document from our wedding planning spread across the surface. Tax returns, investment statements, insurance policies, and that thick manila folder containing our prenuptial agreement, which hadn't seen daylight since we'd signed it 3 years ago. So, she said without looking up, her voice carrying that particular tone wives use when they're about to have conversations their husbands really don't want to have. Did you really have to do it like that? I poured myself a scotch. Not the Macallan 25 tonight, just regular 20-year-old stuff that only cost $400 a bottle, and sat down across from her. The city lights were starting to twinkle outside. Manhattan's nightly transformation from business district to something that looked almost magical if you didn't think too hard about what was actually happening down there. Like what? I asked, even though we both knew exactly what she meant. Like you were conducting a hostile takeover of my family's company. Like you were some private equity asshole who bought distressed debt just to humiliate people at board meetings. That stung a little, mainly because it wasn't entirely wrong. The techniques I'd used, debt for equity swaps, preferred share conversions, protective provisions buried in corporate charter amendments, were exactly the kind of financial engineering that hostile raiders had been perfecting since the 1980s. The fact that I'd used them to save the company instead of strip it for parts didn't change the fundamental mechanics. Your sister spent her first week as CFO trying to sell the company to Atlas Ridge and leak our proprietary technology to our biggest competitor, I said, keeping my voice as calm as I could manage. What exactly was the gentle way to handle that? Sophia finally looked up from her laptop, and I could see she'd been crying. Not the dramatic, mascara-running kind of crying you see in movies, but the quiet, exhausted kind that comes from realizing your family isn't what you thought it was. I know what Ivy did was wrong, she said, but she's still my sister. And the way you just obliterated her in front of the board, in front of Dad, it looked personal. It wasn't personal. It was business. Everything is business with you, Lawson. Even us, apparently. She gestured at the prenup, and I realized she'd been going through our financial arrangements with the kind of methodical attention usually reserved for due diligence reviews. Our joint accounts, the trust structures we'd established, the equity positions that technically made her one of LMG's shareholders, albeit a minority one. That's not fair, I said, but even as the words came out, I wasn't entirely sure they were true. When you spend your professional life thinking in terms of risk management and asset protection, it's hard to turn off that analytical framework when you get home, isn't it? You restructured my family's company without telling me. You've been planning this takeover for 2 years, and I found out about it at the same time as everyone else. How is that not treating our marriage like a business transaction? I took a long sip of the scotch and tried to figure out how to explain corporate governance to someone who was understandably more concerned with family dynamics than Delaware law. I didn't plan a takeover. I planned a rescue. Your father came to me when the company was 6 months away from bankruptcy. I could have let it fail, or I could have structured a solution that kept it in family hands while giving me enough control to prevent exactly the kind of stupidity your sister just demonstrated. But you didn't tell me. Your father asked me not to. He wanted time for the family to adjust to the new reality before we made the ownership structure public. Sophia laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. The new reality where my husband owns 77% of my family's legacy and my sister gets escorted out by security guards. The new reality where your family's legacy doesn't get carved up by private equity vultures who would have fired half the employees and sold the real estate to the highest bidder. That seemed to land. Sophia knew enough about business to understand what Atlas Ridge's friendly recapitalization would have actually meant for LMG's 140 employees, most of whom had been with the company for years and had families to support. She closed her laptop and rubbed her eyes. I need to understand something. If this was really about protecting the company, why does it feel like you were protecting it from us? That was a fair question, and probably one I should have been prepared for. Because us included someone who was actively trying to sell trade secrets to our competitors. Look, Sophia, I love your family. I respect what your father built. I want to preserve it, and I want everyone to succeed. But I'm not going to let emotional loyalty override fiduciary responsibility. Fiduciary responsibility to who? To the company, to the employees, to the shareholders, including your father and including you. She pulled out the prenup and spread it across the table like she was reading tea leaves. Speaking of shareholders, I've been thinking about our little arrangement here. Our prenuptial agreement was a work of art, drafted by 2 of Manhattan's most expensive family law attorneys with the kind of precision usually reserved for international treaties. We both insisted on independent counsel, full financial disclosure, and what lawyers call procedural safeguards to ensure nobody could claim they'd been coerced into signing. The agreement was fair, probably more than fair. Sophia retained separate ownership of assets she'd brought into the marriage, including her inheritance from her grandmother and the small equity stake in LMG that had been gifted to her for tax planning purposes. I kept my startup equity and my various investment positions. Everything acquired during the marriage would be split according to a formula that took into account both financial and non-financial contributions. But here's the thing about prenups that most people don't understand. They're not just legal documents. They're trust exercises. When 2 people sign a prenup, they're essentially saying, I love you enough to marry you, but I'm realistic enough to plan for the possibility that we might someday hate each other. What exactly are you thinking? I asked, trying to keep the defensive edge out of my voice. I'm thinking that my stake in LNG just became a lot more valuable, and I'm wondering whether our agreement adequately reflects that new reality. She was right, of course. Her minority position in a family business had been worth maybe low seven figures when we'd signed the prenup. Her minority position in a company that was now attracting acquisition interest in the nine-figure range was a completely different asset class. The prenup covers appreciation of premarital assets, I pointed out. Your LMG shares were separate property when we got married, so any increase in value remains separate property. Unless I can demonstrate that the increase was due to marital effort or marital assets. I stared at her. Are you threatening to challenge our prenup? I'm trying to understand whether my husband thinks of me as a business partner or as a potential liability. That hit harder than it should have. The truth was, I'd been so focused on protecting everyone's financial interests that I'd forgotten to consider the emotional cost of making unilateral decisions about other people's lives. Corporate governance might be clear-cut, but family relationships are messier than any legal document can anticipate. I think of you as my wife, I said finally. I think of your family as people I care about who needed help, and I think of your sister as someone who made catastrophically bad decisions that could have destroyed everything your father spent 40 years building. Sophia was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the city lights like she was trying to read some kind of message in them. If you told me what you were planning, I could have talked to Ivy. Maybe prevented some of this. Maybe. Or maybe she would have accelerated her timeline with Atlas Ridge, and we'd be having a very different conversation right now. We'll never know, will we? No, we won't. She started gathering up the financial documents, creating neat stacks the way she'd learned during her brief stint at Goldman Sachs before deciding investment banking wasn't for her. I need you to promise me something. What? Promise me you won't destroy her publicly. Whatever happens with the compliance investigation, whatever settlement you negotiate, don't humiliate my sister in the press or the business community. She's made enough mistakes for one lifetime. I finished my scotch and thought about the cease and desist letters Mireille was drafting, the potential securities violations we'd uncovered, the employment lawyers who would probably be very interested in Ivy's unauthorized compensation decisions. There were a dozen different ways this could escalate into the kind of corporate scandal that makes front-page business news. I'll keep it contained, I promised. If she cooperates with the investigation and agrees to a reasonable settlement, we'll handle this quietly. No public statements, no leaked documents, no victory laps in the Wall Street Journal. And if she doesn't cooperate, then we litigate. But even then, we let the court documents speak for themselves. Sophia nodded and closed the prenup folder. I forgot you were a lawyer before you became a tech entrepreneur. I never stopped being a lawyer. I just started building companies instead of just writing contracts for them. She stood up and kissed me on the forehead, the kind of gesture that suggested forgiveness without necessarily implying approval. Next time you plan to save my family's company, maybe give me a heads up? Next time I will. Our bedroom. I wondered if there would be a next time, or if some relationships couldn't survive the collision between business necessities and family loyalties, no matter how carefully you drafted the legal documents. The thing about corporate drama is that it's incredibly distracting from the actual work of running a business. While everyone was gossiping about boardroom coups and family dysfunction, we still had customers to serve, products to ship, and a machine learning algorithm that wasn't going to optimize itself. So the morning after my uncomfortable conversation with Sophia about prenups and family loyalty, I did what I always do when things get complicated. I focused on the fundamentals. First order of business. Rebuild the finance team that Ivy had systematically dismantled during her brief reign of terror. She'd managed to sideline 3 competent people in favor of her business school buddies, creating a power vacuum that would have made Machiavelli proud. Time to fix that clusterfuck. Nikita Volkov was my first call. I'd worked with Nikita during the Series A fundraising, and she had the kind of clean reputation that made auditors smile and regulators nod approvingly. Former Big Four experience, CPA credentials that weren't bought from some diploma mill, and most importantly, zero connections to Ivy's social network of overprivileged Manhattan finance bros. Nikita, I need you to take over as interim CFO while we sort out this governance situation. Standard compensation package, equity participation, and a clear mandate to unfuck whatever financial reporting disasters you're going to find. How bad is it? She asked, which was exactly the right question. Bad enough that we're doing a complete compliance review, but not so bad that you can't fix it in a few months if you're willing to work weekends and drink a lot of coffee. She was in my office by lunch, armed with forensic accounting software and the kind of methodical attention to detail that makes financial statements tell the truth instead of whatever story management wants them to tell. Next up, restoring the compliance function that Ivy had gutted faster than a private equity firm strips assets. Amina Farouk had been L&G's head of compliance for 8 years before Ivy decided that regulatory overhead was preventing agile decision-making. Translation: following the law was cramping her style, so she'd reassigned Amina to special projects and hired some consulting firm to handle compliance on a part-time basis. Amina, you're back in your old role with an expanded mandate. I want you to map every contract, audit every vendor relationship, and review every financial commitment that's been made in the last 6 months. If it doesn't have proper authorization, flag it. If it violates company policy, document it. If it breaks federal law, call Mireille immediately. What's my budget for external support? Whatever you need. This isn't about cost control. This is about making sure we don't get indicted by the Southern District of New York. While Nikita and Amina were digging through the wreckage of Ivy's financial planning, I turned my attention to the operations side. Marco Rinaldi, our COO, had been holding things together with the corporate equivalent of duct tape and prayer while everyone else was playing Game of Thrones in the boardroom. Marco, let's talk about those strategic initiatives that were sucking oxygen away from actual revenue-generating activities. He pulled up a PowerPoint presentation that looked like it had been designed by someone who'd overdosed on business school case studies. Brand positioning, consultant engagement, market awareness enhancement program, and something called narrative architecture development. Total cost, $2.4 million over 18 months. And what exactly would we get for that investment? A new logo, some thought leadership articles, and maybe a booth at industry conferences where we could hand out branded stress balls. I deleted the entire project with the kind of satisfaction usually reserved for canceling subscriptions to services you never used. Kill it. All of it. Take that budget and put it back into R&D where it belongs. Already done. The Verdict AI team has been waiting for approval to expand their machine learning infrastructure. Now they can actually afford the GPU clusters they need to train the next generation models. That was music to my ears. While Ivy had been fantasizing about turning L&G into some kind of lifestyle brand, our actual competitive advantage was sitting in a server farm in Virginia, processing millions of legal documents and getting smarter every day. Verdict AI 3.2 was already in beta testing with 3 major law firms, and the early feedback was exactly what you want to hear. Lawyers were using it to win cases they wouldn't have won otherwise. The AI stack we built wasn't just faster than the competition. It was fundamentally better at understanding legal context. Our natural language processing models could identify relevant precedents that human researchers would miss, predict judicial outcomes with accuracy that made veteran litigators nervous, and organize evidence in ways that turned complex cases into clear narratives. The kind of technology that makes billable hours more productive instead of just more expensive. What's our sales pipeline looking like? I asked Marco, pulling up the CRM dashboard that tracked our customer acquisition funnel. 3 major law firm pilots that had stalled during the transition period. But now that we've got proper product support back, we can reopen those conversations. Plus 2 inbound leads from firms that heard about our evidence mapping capabilities through word of mouth. Word of mouth is the holy grail of B2B software sales. When lawyers start recommending your product to other lawyers, you know you've built something that actually solves real problems instead of just automating existing inefficiencies. The legal technology market was littered with startups that had raised millions of dollars to build solutions nobody wanted. We built something people were willing to pay for, which made us practically unicorns in the legal tech space. Of course, success brings its own problems. By Thursday, I was fielding calls from venture capital firms who'd apparently decided that L&G's corporate restructuring made us an even more attractive investment opportunity. Nothing says hot startup like a boardroom coup and some family drama, apparently. Lawson, it's Brad Stevenson from Altitude Ventures. Heard through the grapevine that you might be raising a growth round. We'd love to get on your calendar to discuss strategic partnership opportunities. Translation. We have too much money and not enough places to put it, and your corporate dysfunction suggests you might be desperate enough to accept a lower valuation than you deserve. Thanks for the interest, Brad, but we're not actively fundraising right now. The company is well capitalized and growing profitably. What about a minority position? We're very founder-friendly, and we could provide operational support for scaling your go-to-market strategy. I'll keep that in mind if our circumstances change. I hung up and immediately got another call from a different VC firm with basically the same pitch. Then another. Word travels fast in Manhattan's insular finance community, and apparently our little family drama had made us the hot new thing in enterprise software investing. The irony wasn't lost on me. 6 months ago, these same firms would have demanded extensive due diligence, multiple board seats, and liquidation preferences that would have diluted our equity into homeopathic concentrations. Now that we demonstrated the kind of ruthless corporate governance that private equity firms respect, they were offering to write checks with minimal strings attached. But we didn't need their money, which is exactly when venture capital becomes most eager to give it to you. Verdict AI was generating positive cash flow, LMG's operations were stabilizing, and our combined entity had enough runway to execute our growth plan without external funding. The best position to be in when evaluating investment offers is not needing them at all. The all-hands meeting was scheduled for Friday afternoon in our main conference room. I wanted to address the elephant in the room, the fact that everyone's supposed new CFO had been escorted out by security, without turning it into a corporate soap opera. I wore the same Tom Ford suit I'd worn to Ivy's $48,000 celebration, partly because it projected the right kind of authority and partly because I have a twisted sense of humor about symbolic gestures. This week has been eventful. I began, which got a few nervous laughs from the assembled staff. But I want to be clear about something. The changes in our executive team aren't about drama or politics. They're about ensuring that LMG continues to operate with the highest standards of corporate governance and fiduciary responsibility. I clicked to the next slide, showing our Q3 financial results. Revenue up 18% year-over-year, EBITDA margins expanding, customer acquisition costs declining. The kind of numbers that make investors write checks and employees feel secure about their jobs. We're profitable, we're growing, and we're building technology that's changing how legal professionals work. None of that changes because of personnel decisions at the executive level. Helena Duarte, who'd agreed to stay on as an independent director, was sitting in the front row taking notes. Having board-level support for the transition was crucial for maintaining institutional credibility, especially when rumors were inevitably circulating about hostile takeovers and family feuds. "Are we going to be acquired?" asked someone from the back of the room. "We're not actively pursuing acquisition opportunities," I replied, which was technically true. Our focus is on organic growth and product development. But if strategic opportunities arise that benefit shareholders and employees, we'll evaluate them appropriately. The meeting ended with the kind of polite applause that suggested people were cautiously optimistic rather than panicked, which was exactly what I'd been hoping for. No mass exodus, no emergency recruiting to replace people who decided to jump ship, just a company getting back to the business of building value instead of burning it. That evening, I stood in the penthouse looking out at the city lights, a glass of 20-year-old scotch in my hand, and the satisfaction of a crisis successfully managed warming my chest. The Tesla was charging in the garage 40 floors below. Tomorrow's calendar was full of productive meetings instead of emergency damage control, and Verdict AI's machine learning models were processing another 1,000,000 documents while I slept. Sometimes the best strategy is just competent execution of boring fundamentals. No drama, no grand gestures, just the quiet work of building something that lasts. You've got to admire someone who gets escorted out of their family's company by security guards and then decides the appropriate response is to hire a crisis PR firm and file for emergency injunctive relief. It takes a special kind of delusional confidence to look at a situation where you've been caught red-handed violating fiduciary duties and think, you know what this needs? More lawyers and some strategic media spin. Ivy's counterpunch came exactly 8 days after her administrative leave started, which was either perfect timing or spectacularly bad timing, depending on how you look at corporate warfare dynamics. She'd retained Morrison and Associates, a boutique crisis management firm that specialized in what they called executive reputation rehabilitation and what everyone else called making rich people's problems disappear through aggressive gaslighting. The PR strategy was textbook corporate victim playing. Anonymous sources started whispering to business reporters about family power struggles and hostile internal takeovers at LMG. Suddenly, I wasn't the majority shareholder who'd saved a family business from bankruptcy. I was the manipulative son-in-law who'd exploited personal relationships to seize control of assets that didn't rightfully belong to me. Have you seen this bullshit? Mireille asked during our morning legal update call, her voice carrying the kind of professional irritation that comes from watching opposing counsel try obviously stupid tactics. She was reading from what sounded like a very expensive hit piece in one of those industry publications that nobody reads, but everyone pretends to care about. Sources close to the Liang family describe a systematic campaign to undermine established leadership through complex financial instruments that may not reflect the true intentions of the original shareholders, she read in the kind of monotone usually reserved for reading tax code. The timing of these revelations, coinciding with Ivy Liang's appointment to the CFO position, raises questions about the motivations behind recent corporate governance changes. I was sitting in my office, watching Manhattan wake up 40 stories below while sipping coffee that cost more per pound than most people's grocery budgets. Let me guess, I said. They're not actually alleging any specific wrongdoing, just raising questions and concerns about perfectly legal corporate transactions. Exactly. Classic reputation assassination disguised as business journalism. They're hoping to create enough smoke that people assume there must be fire somewhere. But the PR offensive was just the opening act. The main event was the emergency motion Ivy filed in Delaware Chancery Court, seeking immediate reinstatement to her CFO position and temporary restraining orders against what her lawyers characterized as retaliatory actions taken in violation of corporate governance procedures and fiduciary duties. Her legal theory was actually kind of creative, in the way that desperate Hail Mary passes can be creative. She claimed that my equity conversions, while technically legal, violated the implied covenant of good faith and fair dealing because they were designed to circumvent the family's reasonable expectations about corporate control. Furthermore, she argued that placing her on administrative leave without adequate procedural safeguards violated her rights as both a shareholder and an appointed officer. It's complete horseshit, Mireille explained during our strategy session, but it's well-crafted horseshit. Her lawyers are smart enough to focus on equity and process issues rather than trying to challenge the underlying documentation. Our response was swift, comprehensive, and absolutely devastating. Mireille had coordinated with Skadden ARPs, our outside litigation counsel, to prepare what lawyers call a nuclear option brief, the kind of court filing that doesn't just respond to allegations but obliterates them with exhibits, case citations, and the legal equivalent of photographic evidence. We attached every email, every unauthorized contract, every confidential document that Ivy had shared with Atlas Ridge and Lextronix. The Delaware Chancery Court got to read, in excruciating detail, about Ivy's attempts to negotiate a private equity recapitalization without board approval, her disclosure of trade secrets to competitors, and her unauthorized compensation decisions that violated both corporate policies and Delaware law. But the crown jewel was the email thread where Ivy had explicitly told Atlas Ridge that she could influence family shareholders to support a transaction because of certain family dynamics that created opportunities for motivated sellers. In corporate law, that's what we call smoking gun evidence of breach of fiduciary duty. The hearing lasted approximately 47 minutes, which in Delaware Chancery Court time is equivalent to a judicial bitch slap. Vice Chancellor Elizabeth Morrison, no relation to Ivy's PR firm, just one of those cosmic coincidences that make litigation interesting, took exactly 12 minutes to review our exhibit package before asking Ivy's lawyers some very pointed questions about how they planned to defend their clients' communications with potential acquirers. Counsel, the Vice Chancellor said in the kind of tone that makes experienced litigators check their malpractice insurance coverage, "Are you seriously arguing that MS?" Liang's discussions with Atlas Ridge Capital constituted appropriate corporate development activities. Ivy's lead attorney, a partner at some white shoe firm whose hourly rate probably exceeded most people's monthly salaries, tried to thread the needle between zealous advocacy and professional suicide. Your Honor, these were preliminary conversations designed to explore strategic alternatives in the company's best interests. Without board authorization, without disclosure to other shareholders, while simultaneously sharing confidential competitive information with industry competitors. Your Honor, we believe the context of these communications has been mischaracterized. Motion denied. Two words that probably cost Ivy's legal team about $50,000 in fees and completely destroyed whatever momentum her PR campaign might have generated. Delaware Chancery Court doesn't just rule against you. When you bring frivolous claims, they rule against you with the kind of judicial language that makes other lawyers use your case as a cautionary tale. But the real entertainment started after the hearing, when Atlas Ridge Capital's management committee apparently decided that association with Ivy's legal problems might not be optimal for their fund's reputation with institutional investors. Marcus Webb, Atlas Ridge's managing partner, called me personally that afternoon. Lawson, I want you to know that our preliminary discussions with Ms. Leong were purely exploratory and didn't involve any confidential information. Marcus, I have emails where she offered to provide you with insider guidance on optimal negotiating strategies with family shareholders. Your due diligence team received our Series B pitch deck with customer retention metrics and revenue projections. What exactly are we calling purely exploratory here? Long pause. The kind of silence that means someone's lawyer is frantically shaking their head in the background. Perhaps we could discuss a mutually beneficial resolution to any outstanding concerns. Here's my resolution, Marcus. You're going to return all confidential materials, sign a non-disclosure agreement with enforcement provisions that will make your general counsel wake up in cold sweats, and explain to your limited partners why your firm was soliciting insider information from someone who didn't have authority to provide it. That seems reasonable. We'll have our counsel reach out to Ms. Okafor to coordinate. Great. And Marcus? Next time you want to acquire a company, try calling the people who actually own it. The Lextronics situation resolved itself even more efficiently. Apparently, receiving a cease and desist letter that included exhibits of their communications with Ivy had prompted some very urgent internal discussions about trade secret liability and potential tortious interference claims. Their general counsel called Mireille within 24 hours to propose a settlement that included return of all materials, a non-use agreement, and what amounted to a public apology disguised as a clarification of our business development policies. With the legal threats neutralized and the PR campaign backfiring spectacularly, I decided it was time for some positive news that would remind everyone what a properly run company actually looked like. We announced the acquisition of Datamine Analytics, a small e-discovery startup with some genuinely innovative technology for automated document review. It wasn't a huge deal, $15 million in cash plus earnout provisions tied to integration milestones. But it was exactly the kind of strategic bolt-on that demonstrated we were focused on building sustainable competitive advantages instead of playing family politics. The market loved it. Our existing customers got excited about expanded service offerings, our venture capital contacts started calling about synergistic opportunities, and the business press finally had something substantive to write about instead of recycling anonymous gossip about family drama. That evening, I stood in our penthouse looking down at the city lights, holding a glass of Macallan 25 and thinking about how quickly corporate warfare can shift from existential threat to minor inconvenience when you actually own the battlefield. My Tesla was parked in the garage below, fully charged and ready for whatever tomorrow might bring. I texted the operations team. Nice work today. Keep building. Sometimes the most devastating response to someone trying to destroy you is to just keep being successful while they're busy explaining themselves to judges and journalists. Ivy had shot her shot with crisis PR and emergency legal motions. She'd missed spectacularly, and now everyone knew it. The counterpunch had fizzled, and we had a company to run. The board reconvened 2 weeks later with the kind of grim efficiency that usually accompanies corporate executions. Same glass conference room, same mahogany table, but this time nobody was pretending this was anything other than a funeral for someone's career. Amina's compliance report read like a federal indictment. Unauthorized compensation approvals totaling $600,000. Confidential information shared with two separate potential acquirers without board knowledge. Trade secrets disclosed to our biggest competitor. Email evidence of attempted self-dealing that would make securities lawyers rich and executives unemployed. The pattern is unambiguous, Helena said, reviewing the executive summary with the clinical detachment of someone who'd seen this particular corporate tragedy before. This isn't poor judgment. This is systematic breach of fiduciary duties. Hal looked like he'd aged 5 years in 5 weeks. What are our options? I kept my voice steady, professional. We negotiate a separation agreement. No admission of wrongdoing, reasonable severance tied to a non-compete, return of all confidential materials, mutual non-disparagement. Ivy tried one final gambit when she arrived with her attorney. You can't run complex financial operations, Lawson. You're a tech founder, not a... I slid the monthly cash flow analysis across the table. Revenue up 18%, operating expenses down 12%, customer acquisition costs improved across all segments. The numbers speak for themselves. Her lawyer whispered something urgent in her ear. Corporate litigation against a majority shareholder with this much documented evidence would be expensive, time-consuming, and ultimately pointless. She signed. The press release was 2 paragraphs of corporate boilerplate about organizational restructuring and strategic focus. No drama, no finger-pointing, no victory laps. Just business. The board formally appointed me CEO by unanimous vote, with Hal retaining executive chairman. Clean, quiet, professional. 20 minutes later, Ivy walked out of LNG for the last time, carrying a small cardboard box and a separation agreement that would pay her enough to think about her mistakes in comfort. I'm sorry it ended this way, I told Hal as we watched her Tesla disappear into Manhattan traffic. You saved the company, he replied. Sometimes that's what family leadership looks like. A year after Ivy's $48,000 celebration of her own downfall, LNG looks like what happens when you run a company based on competence instead of family drama. Verdict AI is the gold standard for legal AI. Our machine learning models process 12 million pages of discovery documents monthly while law firms line up for licensing deals. We funded a scholarship at Columbia Law for first-generation lawyers because giving back beats giving interviews about disruption. Our acquisition pipeline reads like a private equity wish list. Last month, we bought a niche data analytics firm for their patent portfolio, not their PowerPoint presentations. The inbound offers now start with 9 figures, and we still say no to everyone. Sir, there's a call from Andreessen Horowitz about Series C funding. My assistant mentions during morning coffee rounds. Tell them we're focused on organic growth. And Goldman wants to discuss IPO readiness? Same answer. The beautiful thing about 77% voting control is that not interested remains a complete sentence. At home, Sophia and I take evening walks without discussing cap tables or compliance audits. The prenup stays filed away. Our marriage survived the collision between business and family, and she stopped asking whether I think of her as a liability. Hal visits the office weekly, telling new hires about the coffee man who saved his company. He's proud, relaxed, secure in knowing LNG will outlast all of us. Sometimes I think about that string quartet dissolving into nervous laughter after Ivy's coffee man comment. I still bring cappuccinos to Monday morning meetings, still wear Tom Ford suits that whisper competence instead of screaming insecurity. The difference is that now when I walk into conference rooms at 9 a.m. and open legal binders, nobody's surprised by what they find inside. Real power doesn't announce itself with expensive parties or dramatic boardroom speeches. It just signs the right documents and lets mathematics do the talking.